Welcome back to my channel, and I'm very pleased to have you back. More mysteries are going to be uncovered in this second part of Lena's story. Before then, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like and share. Lena's exploration led her back to the kitchen, where a rotary phone hung on the wall, its once bright color now faded. As she stood there, her eyes drifted to a piece of paper wedged beneath it, a phone number written in her grandmother's handwriting. She couldn't resist dialing it, wondering if it was still active. After a few rings, a voice answered, raspy and hesitant. "Hello. Hi, this is Lena Carter. I'm calling from June's house. I found your number written here." There was a pause. June Carter's granddaughter? The voice sounded surprised, then softened. "I'm Dorothy. I was one of her close friends." Relief washed over Lena. "Dorothy, I'm trying to learn more about my grandmother's life. There's so much I never knew." "Oh, child, she was more than a friend to us all. She was a leader, a protector." Dorothy's voice trembled with emotion. June was part of a movement that saved lives, and she kept us all going when things got hard. Lena's throat tightened. "There's something I need to ask about. A man named MT. Did you know him?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes, I knew him. MT was one of us, a trusted member. But near the end, there were rumors, accusations. June suspected he'd been compromised." Lena's heart pounded. "Compromised?" "Yes, dear. We don't know if he was forced, threatened, or if he chose to turn on us. But June, she never trusted him again." Lena's mind raced. It was as if she were following her grandmother's footsteps, piecing together a mystery June had taken to her grave. As Dorothy spoke, Lena felt the weight of her grandmother's fears, the complexity of a world where loyalty could shift and trust was rare. But even in the face of betrayal, June had held fast. She had kept fighting, her courage a beacon for those around her. And now, Lena felt that courage seeping into her, a steady resolve to uncover the truth and carry her grandmother's story forward. "Thank you, Dorothy," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't let her memory fade." Hanging up, Lena stood in silence, her grandmother's legacy pressing down on her like a mantle. She was ready for whatever came next, determined to carry on the fight June had left behind. Later that night, Lena couldn't shake the conversation with Dorothy. She felt compelled to return to the attic, hoping there was more to discover. Moving boxes and dusting off old shelves, she came across a small ornate frame hidden in a dark corner. Inside was a black and white photograph of June and a group of people standing outside a modest church. They looked proud, with a sense of quiet defiance in their stances. But Lena's eyes were drawn to a figure on the edge of the photo, a tall man with piercing eyes and a strong jaw. She flipped the frame over and found a date, March 15, 1965. Realization struck her as she remembered learning about the historic march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, in that same month. Could her grandmother have been there? And was this man beside her in the photo JT? Lena couldn't ignore the energy radiating from the photograph. She felt as though she was standing with them, caught up in their cause. Her fingers traced her grandmother's face, feeling a powerful sense of pride and connection. The more she uncovered, the more she understood that June had been deeply committed to the civil rights movement, willing to risk her life for what she believed in. But one question gnawed at her. Why had her grandmother left all this hidden, as if afraid for anyone to find it? It felt like her grandmother had intended for her to find it, but only when the time was right. Lena knew there was more to discover, and her next step would be to learn all she could about that historic march and the people who had participated. Maybe then, she'd find a way to identify the man beside her grandmother. The next day, Lena decided to visit the local library, hoping to find historical records that might mention her grandmother or JT. She spent hours poring over archives, squinting at microfilm reels, and thumbing through old newspapers. Just as her energy began to wane, she stumbled upon a newspaper article dated March 1965. The article described a gathering of activists, many of whom had come from across the country to join the march. Lena's pulse quickened when she saw June Carter's name listed among those arrested that day, along with a brief mention of a companion known as JT. There, in black and white, was proof of her grandmother's bravery. As she read further, a paragraph caught her eye. A handwritten letter, circulated among those on the march, called for unity, urging participants to stand together for justice, even when the road is hardest. It was signed JT. Lena's heart leaped. She felt as though she were holding a piece of history in her hands, one her grandmother had been part of. She jotted down every detail, determined to learn more about JT's letter. Perhaps Dorothy would know more, or maybe it would lead her to someone else who could help her unravel the rest of the story. She left the library with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling that she was one step closer to finding the truth about her grandmother's past. Armed with her notes, Lena decided to pay Dorothy a visit. She found the elderly woman in a cozy, modest home, filled with photos and mementos from her younger years. Dorothy welcomed Lena warmly, guiding her to a worn couch where they sat with tea. "Dorothy, I found a newspaper article about my grandmother's involvement in the Selma March," Lena began, "and it mentioned a letter, signed by JT. Do you remember it?" Dorothy's eyes softened as she nodded. "Oh yes. That letter was passed from hand to hand like it was a sacred scripture. JT had a way with words, you know. People trusted him, looked to him for guidance." Lena hung on every word. "Do you know what happened to him, Dorothy? Why his letters to my grandmother suddenly stopped?" Dorothy's face grew somber. "That's the question we all asked, child. One day, he just disappeared. We never knew if he went into hiding or if something worse happened." Her voice broke slightly, and Lena could see the pain of old memories etched in her expression. "But June never gave up hope," Dorothy continued. "She believed JT would return one day. And I think that hope was what kept her going." She reached over, clasping Lena's hand. "Your grandmother was one of the strongest women I've ever known, Lena. She fought for what was right, even when it was difficult. And now, it's up to you to carry that legacy." Lena's throat tightened with emotion. She thanked Dorothy and left, her heart heavy yet resolved. She had a mission now, to find out what had truly happened to JT, to honor her grandmother's memory by uncovering the truth. That evening, Lena returned home, her mind swirling with everything she'd learned. She decided to reread her grandmother's journal, hoping to find more clues about JT. As she flipped through the pages, a single entry caught her attention. It was cryptic, almost like a code. "When the river runs dry, the truth will rise." The phrase struck Lena as significant, as if June had left a message intended for someone who would understand its meaning. But what did it mean? Lena read the phrase over and over, searching for hidden meaning. Thinking about Dorothy's words, Lena felt that maybe her grandmother was trying to tell her something about JT's disappearance, something buried beneath the surface. She spent hours pondering the phrase, wondering if it was a clue or a metaphor for something more tangible. Whatever it was, Lena knew she couldn't rest until she figured it out. In her search for answers, Lena decided to comb through the rest of the attic, hoping to find something she might have missed. She found a weathered box filled with maps, each carefully folded and marked with red circles. Lena unfolded one and recognized the familiar geography of the American South. The red circles marked locations across several states, places where protests and marches had taken place. But there was one location, circled in bold, that stood out: Birmingham, Alabama. The words, "safe house," were scribbled beside it in her grandmother's handwriting. Her mind raced. Had her grandmother and JT used safe houses during their travels? And if so, could this one in Birmingham hold the answers Lena was looking for? She felt a surge of excitement mixed with trepidation. Visiting the site might bring her closer to solving the mystery, but it would also mean stepping into her grandmother's world, one filled with danger and secrecy. Without a second thought, she decided she would make the trip. She packed a bag, filled with a sense of purpose and a deepening respect for the courage her grandmother must have had. As she prepared for her journey, Lena couldn't help but feel her grandmother's spirit beside her, guiding her toward the truth. The next morning, Lena set off on her journey to Birmingham, the destination marked boldly on her grandmother's map. She felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as though she were retracing the steps of a history that had been forgotten. The long drive gave Lena time to reflect. She thought of her grandmother and all the choices she had made, the sacrifices she had endured. She wondered if June had ever imagined that one day her granddaughter would follow her path, seeking the answers she had hidden so carefully. The landscape around her changed as she crossed state lines, lush forests giving way to the sun-baked fields and winding roads of the south. The beauty of it took her breath away, yet she knew that beneath this serenity lay the scars of a painful history. As she neared Birmingham, Lena's heart began to race. She was close now, closer than she'd ever been to discovering the truth. She had no idea what she would find, but she felt ready for anything. Lena arrived at the address marked on the map, a modest, unassuming house tucked away on a quiet street. She knocked on the door, half expecting no answer, but a middle-aged woman with a kind face opened it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes cautious but curious. Lena took a deep breath. "I'm June Carter's granddaughter. I think this was once a safe house for activists." The woman's face softened. "You must be Lena. I knew your grandmother well." She opened the door wider, inviting Lena inside. The interior of the house was simple but filled with warmth. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Jacobs and led Lena to a small room filled with memorabilia, posters, newspaper clippings, and faded photographs. "She stayed here with JT many times," Mrs. Jacobs said, her voice filled with nostalgia. They were both so brave, standing up for what they believed in. But they also carried a lot of secrets. She handed Lena a photograph of her grandmother and JT, standing side by side, their faces filled with determination. "Do you know what happened to him?" Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Jacobs hesitated, her expression grave. "I know he disappeared, but June never lost faith. She believed he'd been forced into hiding. She thought one day he'd come back." Lena felt a rush of emotions. She thanked Mrs. Jacobs and left the house, her mind swirling with new questions. Her grandmother's legacy was more complicated than she had ever imagined, filled with layers of love, courage, and sacrifice. As she drove back, she knew her journey was far from over. JT's fate still eluded her, and the cryptic messages her grandmother had left behind felt like a trail leading her deeper into the heart of a mystery that had yet to be fully unraveled. Back home, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Inspired by Mrs. Jacobs' stories and the new photograph, she returned to the attic, determined to give it a thorough search. She moved boxes, shifted furniture, and carefully examined the walls, knocking on each one. Her hand paused over a section of wall near the back. The sound was hollow. Curiosity surged, and Lena ran her fingers along the edges until she found a hidden latch. She held her breath and pulled it. To her astonishment, a small door swung open, revealing a narrow, dusty room. Inside, there were stacks of old files, photographs, and letters bundled tightly. Among the papers, Lena found a journal, different from the one she'd seen before. This one seemed to contain coded entries, like a logbook filled with names, dates, and places she didn't recognize. At the top of one page, she saw her grandmother's initials, JC, alongside a list of people labeled friends and allies, with JT listed first. Realizing that these papers might hold the key to JT's disappearance, Lena carefully gathered everything, her heart racing. She was now holding pieces of her grandmother's life that no one else had seen, a hidden story waiting to be told. But the question of why it had been kept hidden loomed large in her mind. With the coded entries in her hand, Lena knew she needed help decoding them, and she knew just the person to ask. Lena sought out Professor Tom Parker, an old friend of her family and a retired historian who specialized in civil rights-era records. Meeting him in his cozy study, she presented the coded journal, hoping he could help make sense of the entries. Realizing that these papers might hold the key to JT's disappearance, Lena carefully gathered everything, her heart racing. She was now holding pieces of her grandmother's life that no one else had seen, a hidden story waiting to be told. But the question of why it had been kept hidden loomed large in her mind. With the coded entries in her hand, Lena knew she needed help decoding them, and she knew just the person to ask. Professor Parker adjusted his glasses, his brows lifting in intrigue. "This is remarkable, Lena. I haven't seen a personal record like this in ages. These codes were often used by activists to protect sensitive information. I'll need a little time, but I'll help you decode this." The professor flipped through the journal, studying each line. "It looks like your grandmother had contacts in nearly every major southern state involved in the movement," he said, sounding impressed. "And this JT, whoever he was, he must have been very close to her." Lena nodded, watching as Parker took notes. She shared her theories and discoveries, eager to piece together what her grandmother and JT had been involved in. They arranged to meet again in a few days, giving Parker time to work his decoding magic. As she left, Lena felt a growing sense of anticipation. Whatever secrets this journal held, they were powerful enough for her grandmother to have hidden them all these years. She wondered if they might finally reveal JT's fate. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, lightning flashing across the sky as Lena sat by her window, her mind swirling with thoughts. She read through her grandmother's journal again, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. The storm seemed to match her own turbulent emotions, each rumble of thunder reflecting the sense of urgency she felt. She thought of the legacy she was uncovering, a legacy filled with courage and secrets that had been hidden even from family. Her grandmother had lived a life beyond what anyone had known, risking everything for justice. Lena felt both pride and fear, a fear of what she might find, and a fear of what it would mean for her family. In the flashes of lightning, Lena felt a strange calm. The storm had always brought her grandmother peace, she remembered, a time to reflect and gather strength. Lena hoped to channel that strength now, knowing she'd need it for the challenges ahead. She wasn't sure what the journal would reveal, but she was prepared to face it. A few days later, Lena returned to Professor Parker's study. He greeted her with an excited smile, holding up the decoded pages. "Lena, your grandmother was part of a network of activists who organized protests, arranged safe houses, and even planned counteractions to blockades set by authorities." Lena scanned the pages, absorbing the details. Her grandmother had been fearless, coordinating actions under the noses of local law enforcement. There were lists of names she didn't recognize, places marked with red dots, and references to J.T. Parker pointed to a section in the journal with an underlined entry. "The last stop, New Orleans. J.T. and I will part ways here. He must find safety, no matter the cost." Lena's heart sank as she read those words. Her grandmother had sent JT away, likely to protect him. But did he ever make it to safety? And if he did, why hadn't he reached out to her grandmother again? Professor Parker put a reassuring hand on Lena's shoulder. This journal hints that your grandmother's work wasn't just local. She was involved in something much larger, a movement that affected countless lives. Whatever happened to JT, it seems she made that sacrifice for the greater good. As Lena left, she clutched the journal, feeling closer than ever to her grandmother's world, yet more determined to find out the truth about JT. Feeling drawn to the words in the journal, Lena packed her bags and headed to New Orleans. She reached out to local activists and archivists, hoping to find someone who remembered her grandmother or JT and could offer clues about his fate. At a community center filled with historical records, Lena met an elderly woman named Alma. She showed Alma the journal entry, and Alma's eyes softened in recognition. "I remember June," Alma said, a wistful smile crossing her face. "And I remember JT too. He was, well, let's just say he was a force to be reckoned with. They were like family to me." Lena's pulse quickened. "Do you know what happened to him? Why he disappeared?" Alma's face grew serious. JT was in deep trouble. There were powerful people who didn't want his voice heard. He had to go into hiding, and even June couldn't know where he was going. She placed a hand on Lena's. Sometimes, silence was the greatest protection. Lena thanked Alma, feeling the weight of these revelations. As she walked back to her hotel, she felt both sadness and gratitude for her grandmother's bravery and JT's sacrifice. She was piecing together their story, even if the answers were bittersweet. Back in her hotel room, Lena sifted through the journal again, inspired by Alma's memories. At the bottom of one page, she noticed faint indentations, as if someone had written a letter beneath it. She quickly grabbed a pencil, shading over the page to reveal faint words. "JT, no matter what happens, my heart will always remember you." The words felt like a final goodbye, a message her grandmother had left for JT. Lena realized that this journal was more than just a record of events. It was her grandmother's heart laid bare, a story of love and sacrifice woven into the fabric of history. She felt a surge of longing, as if her grandmother were right beside her, sharing secrets from the past. These letters showed her grandmother's unwavering dedication and love for JT, and Lena felt honored to have discovered them. She spent hours reading, immersing herself in June's words and feeling the connection deepen. It was clear to her now that JT had been more than an activist to June. He had been her true love, one she had to let go for the sake of a cause bigger than them both. As Lena prepared to leave New Orleans, one last letter caught her eye. It was written in her grandmother's handwriting, dated months after JT had gone into hiding. "I know where you are, JT. I'll come if you ever send for me." The letter was filled with hope and longing, and a single name stood out at the bottom: Riverstone Inn. Lena's heart pounded. This could be the last place her grandmother knew JT had stayed, a place that might hold the key to his fate. Determined to follow this new lead, Lena gathered her things and left for the Riverstone Inn. The journey was filled with anticipation, and she hoped that by retracing her grandmother's steps, she might finally uncover the truth. Lena arrived at Riverstone Inn, a historic place on the outskirts of New Orleans that felt like it had barely changed over the decades. The inn was a modest, brick building with ivy-covered walls and large oak trees standing proudly on either side. It looked like a place that held secrets in its walls, where whispers of the past might still linger. Inside, Lena approached the front desk and explained her unusual request to the receptionist, an older man named Earl, who had worked at the inn for over 50 years. She asked if he knew anything about a man named JT who had stayed here years ago. Earl leaned back, his eyes narrowing in concentration. JT, you say? He thought for a moment before nodding. Yes, I remember. He was here often, back in the 60s. Real polite, kept to himself mostly. Seemed like he had a lot on his mind. Lena's heart leaped. Do you know where he went? Or if he left anything behind? Earl scratched his chin thoughtfully. I remember he had a box he kept in our storage room. Some guests used it for safekeeping, and since JT was here often, he must have felt comfortable leaving it with us. If it's still here, you're welcome to look. Earl led Lena down a narrow hallway to the storage room, filled with boxes and old trunks covered in dust. After some searching, he found an unmarked box tucked away in the back. Lena took a deep breath as she carefully opened it, her fingers trembling with anticipation. Inside, she found an envelope with her grandmother's name on it. Her pulse quickened as she opened it, feeling like she was about to read her grandmother's last words to JT. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in her grandmother's delicate handwriting. It was a message from June to JT, but one that seemed to be left unfinished. My dearest JT, I hope you are well and safe. There are times I still hear your voice, calling me back to those days when we believed we could change the world. I wish we could go back to that time, when all we had was each other and the cause. I need you to know. The letter trailed off abruptly, as if her grandmother had been interrupted. It left Lena with more questions than answers, the words filling her with both hope and sorrow. She felt her grandmother's love, her dedication, and the ache of what had been left unsaid. Alongside the letter, there was an old map with several locations marked in red ink, spanning towns and cities from New Orleans to Memphis. Lena traced the path with her finger, realizing it was likely the route her grandmother and JT had traveled together, organizing protests and building their network of allies. The map felt like a message from her grandmother, a reminder of all the places where their story unfolded. Lena folded the map carefully, tucking it into her bag. She felt certain this was her next step, a journey to uncover the full story that lay hidden in each of those marked locations. Determined to follow the map, Lena made her way to Baton Rouge, the first location circled in red. She contacted a local history group to see if anyone remembered her grandmother or JT. The response was overwhelming. Several community members recalled stories about a fearless woman named June who had helped organize protests during the civil rights movement. At a local diner, Lena met with a woman named Marcia, who remembered June vividly. Your grandmother was a firecracker, Marcia said with a smile. She was always rallying folks, encouraging us to stand up for ourselves. Marcia shared tales of the protests June and JT had organized, recalling how they'd faced down opposition and worked tirelessly to make sure everyone's voices were heard. Your grandmother never backed down, Marcia said, pride shining in her eyes. She and JT were unstoppable. The stories painted a picture of a brave, determined woman who had risked everything for her beliefs. Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was walking the same path her grandmother and JT had walked, uncovering a legacy of courage and resilience. As she left Baton Rouge, Lena felt closer to her grandmother than ever. She had only just begun to understand the impact June had made, and she couldn't wait to see what the other towns on the map would reveal. Jackson, Mississippi, was Lena's next stop. There, she visited a historic church known for hosting civil rights meetings. She was introduced to Pastor Gregory, who had known her grandmother and JT well. He invited her to his office, where he kept a few records from that era, hoping they might hold some significance. Pastor Gregory handed her a photograph of June and JT standing together on the steps of the church, their expressions serious but determined. They were working with us to organize a march, he explained. JT spoke to everyone that day. He was eloquent, magnetic. People couldn't help but listen to him. Lena traced her grandmother's face in the photo, noticing how young and full of hope she looked. Pastor Gregory showed her a copy of an old flyer advertising a rally where JT was a key speaker. "They were like family to us," he said softly. "I remember they shared a dream of a better world, even when it felt like that world was far away." As Lena drove away from Jackson, she felt an even deeper respect for her grandmother and JT. The people they had touched, the courage they had inspired. It all felt larger than life, as if their legacy had been woven into the very fabric of each town they had visited. Next on the map was a small, quiet town in Tennessee, where Lena met an elderly man named Ray who had been a close friend of JT. He invited her into his home, his eyes gleaming with memories as he recounted stories from the past. "JT and your grandmother were two sides of the same coin," Ray said. "They kept each other going, even when things got dangerous. He told me once that your grandmother was his anchor, the one thing that kept him grounded when everything else felt uncertain." Ray paused, as if considering whether to share more. Finally, he leaned closer, his voice lowering. "There's something you should know, Lena. JT didn't just disappear. He went underground, on purpose. There were powerful people after him, people who didn't want him speaking out." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "You mean, he chose to leave?" Ray nodded solemnly. "It was the only way to protect June and himself. He told me he'd come back one day, but the years went by, and, well, it never happened. Your grandmother knew the risks, but she kept his memory alive. She never stopped hoping he'd return." Hearing this left Lena feeling both heartbroken and awed. Her grandmother's life had been filled with sacrifices and heartbreaks that no one had known. She thanked Ray and left with a heavy heart, feeling the weight of her grandmother's lost love and the legacy she had protected at all costs. What will happen in the third part of this story? More mysteries are still yet to be uncovered. Please hit the subscribe button to get notifications.